Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are from Geneva. Welcome to this press briefing. It's our first of 2022. So I'll start the briefing by wishing everyone a Happy New Year. We certainly hope that it will be a better year in 2022 for the airline industry than it was in 2021. Today I'm joined by our Director General, Willie Walsh, as well as our new Chief Economist, Marie Owens-Thompson. We have a fair number of items to get through. We have the full year results for cargo. We also have the full year results for passenger to talk about, as well as we'll shortly be having a release on our views towards normalization of air travel, which we're hoping will achieve over the course of this year, hopefully early in the year. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Willie, who will have a short presentation. And then after that, we will throw it open to questions. As usual, questions will be via the chat function. I see we've already got a few in there. Please get them in early so that we can have them in the queue, and once we're done with the presentation part, move through them as quickly as possible. So with that said, Willie, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and good afternoon from Geneva. Thank you for joining us. So as Tony said, a short presentation which I'll take you through, and then we'll go to your questions. So we go to the first slide. And this presentation is in the form that you should be familiar with. So we're reviewing today the full year performance for both passenger and cargo, and I'll comment briefly on some December figures as well. But as you can see, for passenger in 2021, we were at 42% of 2019 levels. For cargo, we're actually ahead of 2019, up 7%, 6.9% versus 2019. And you can see on the chart there, as we have commented previously, domestic leading the way on passenger side. It was down 28.2% versus 2019, with international travel down 75.5%. The industry then has set at 58.4%. You can see there the trend towards the end of the year on international travel was quite good, and I'll comment on that at the moment. But a great year for cargo. It was 18.7% ahead of 2020. Finished the year strongly, up 8.9% in December versus 2019, up 7.8% versus 2020. So cargo continued to be a very important source of revenue and cash for the airline industry. And again, great credit to the airlines who've managed to pivot their business to take advantage of the cargo opportunity. Still some challenges there impacting on the supply chain. We've talked about those before, but I think the outlook continues to be positive for cargo as we go into 2022. If I turn to the next slide, just look a bit more detail at the domestic. Now, interestingly, domestic represented just over 62% of total traffic, which is a complete reversal from where we were in 2019, when domestic was 36% of total traffic. So this reinforces what we've been saying for some time, that domestic travel, where generally there are few, if any, government restrictions, shows that people will travel. The domestic markets have recovered quite strongly from the initial decline back in March of 2020. And you can see in Russia, domestic travel above where it was in 2019 at 24.2% above. The US market performed well, 23.8%, and continues to do well. And the area that has lagged there in domestic terms is Australia at 62.4% down, and that's because of border closures within Australia. The domestic travel for India and Japan is in the middle there between between China and Australia at minus 42 and minus 58%. But overall, domestic markets perform strongly, and now, as I said, represents over 60% of all travel, or did in 2021. Moving on to the next slide, the international markets. You can see they're actually recovering towards the end of the year in most markets, with the exception of the Asia Pacific region, which has continued to lag significantly behind the rest of the world. And that's solely down to the travel restrictions that exist in that part of the world. In fact, I was just looking before we went online. In 2019, the international travel within Asia, within that region, represented 13.3% of international travel, second biggest market after the within Europe market. So in 2019, it was 13.3% of the market. In 2021, it was 1.5%. And indeed, even more staggering, the seat factor in 2019 was 80%. In 2021, it was 26%. So it just shows actually the total collapse of international travel in that region. And that's, I would say, solely down to the restrictions on international travel that have been imposed by governments. Europe, which was about, well, actually it represented in 2021, I think about half of all international travel, was recovering through the year. It was in the middle of the pack there, down 67.6%. So it's a positive end to the year. And as we go into 2022, we have cautioned about some short-term impact because of Omicron and the reintroduction of some restrictions towards the end of the year. But I think once those restrictions start to be removed, and we're seeing evidence of that now, we should see international travel recover because it's clear that the underlying demand from passengers remains quite strong. If we move on to the next slide, this one I think you'll find very interesting, and I think it has surprised me. I've been watching this as we've been going through the year. And this shows the premium and the economy. Now, I have to caution once again, when we talk about premium, that doesn't necessarily relate to business travel, because you get a lot of people traveling in premium cabins that are traveling on leisure as well. So this isn't a comment about business travel, it's a comment about premium travel against economy. But in effect, the premium market has been recovering at the same rate as the economy travel. This is up to the end of November. We don't have the detailed December figures, but I don't expect to see any change. And I think that should come as a surprise to people, particularly those who have sort of focused on business travel rather than differentiating between people who travel in the premium cabins and people who travel in the economy cabins. But premium travel recovering at the same pace as the economy. Still a long way to go. These are for international routes, but I think that's a positive indication. I'll move on to the next slide. Now, we've talked a lot about people's willingness to travel, and all of the evidence that we've seen as we've gone through the year indicates that there is a strong willingness to travel. And I think this is well shown here in this chart. This is bookings within South Africa. And you can see the impact of bookings as restrictions were introduced towards the end of November. I think the Omicron variant was identified on the 24th of November. And you can see the impact that had on bookings. But then the gradual improvement in bookings, despite the fact that the new COVID cases in the region continue to climb, you could see bookings increase, and they have steadily increased as the variant and the new cases have started to decline as well. So no matter what way we look at this, when we slice and dice the data that we have available to us, it very strongly tells us that once restrictions are removed, the underlying demand is good. And what has caused uncertainty in the minds of consumer has been the removal and reintroduction of restrictions and the uncertainty around what rules apply. But I'm pleased to say that we are seeing some positive signs in relation to government actions on this side. And moving on. This we've shown you before, so you should be very familiar with it. But the simple message here is we can't find any correlation between the introduction of these restrictions and suppression of the virus. In fact, if you look at, we'll say the end of 2020, December 2020, when a lot of restrictions were in place, you could see cases increasing and then decreasing and then increasing again, despite no changes to government policy. So, as we've said on many occasions, these restrictions on international travel do very little, very, very little to suppress the transmission of the virus. And going to the next slide, I think you can see that the virus, as we've talked about, despite widespread transmission, these are UK figures, but it's typical of what most countries around the world are seeing. Huge spike in cases, but not seeing the same corresponding increase in hospitalization that we witnessed during previous spikes. And the next slide is from data in the UK. This is an analysis of a study and research done by Edge Health and Auxura. It's available online, a fascinating piece of research. And it shows what would have happened if different travel policies were in place. And in effect, what it says is that once the virus is in the country, having international restrictions on travel does absolutely nothing to suppress the transmission. In fact, if you look at the blue line, what it's saying there is, the only action that really could have suppressed transmission is actions within the domestic markets. In other words, putting everybody into lockdown. But these travel restrictions do very little, if anything, to stop the transmission of the virus. It has I think under the research that we did, about a 3% impact and delays the peak by a couple of days. But realistically, it doesn't have any meaningful impact and just reinforces our view. I think strongly reinforces our view that if you look at the science and if you look at the data, then there's no reason to have these restrictions in place, particularly for people who are fully vaccinated. So we continue to argue that international restrictions for fully vaccinated people should not apply. They should be free to travel without testing and without restriction. And for those who can't be vaccinated because they haven't had access to vaccines or for other reasons can't be vaccinated, well, then a sensible testing regime can be an effective means of managing the risk. And we'll move on. I think a couple of issues that are on the minds of airline management teams at the moment relates to the rising cost of oil and jet fuel in particular. I know most people focus on the price of Brent. This here shows the average price of a barrel of jet fuel, significantly higher than our last forecast, which was in October of last year, where we had forecasted to be at just under $78. The average for January has been just over $101. In fact, when I looked this morning, I think it was $102. And fuel, as you know, represents the single biggest element of an airline's cost base. If I look back over the last 20 years, it averaged 25.6%. And that ranged from about 12.5% in 2002 up to 38% in 2008. So clearly, this is something that airlines will be closely monitoring. And given what we've seen over the last couple of years, it's unlikely that most airlines will have significant hedging in place to protect them against this increase in the oil price. So I think this will be a factor, certainly playing into fares as we go through the year if the oil price remains high. And finally, I think we've one more slide. And on a positive note, the industry is optimistic. This is research that we do on business confidence, and it looks at what airline CFOs think will happen to passenger volumes and cargo volumes. And as you see, they've continued to be generally positive as we've gone through the latter part of 2021. The reason the cargo volumes, some people see them coming down slightly, is because, as I mentioned earlier, we have been operating at record levels of cargo. So it's been very, very good through the year. That's not to say we're pessimistic about cargo in 2022. Quite the opposite. In fact, we're optimistic, but we are at a significant high. But I think we're ending the year generally in better shape than we started the year. Going into 2022, I think there will be a short-term impact as a result of government restrictions in response to the Omicron variant that we've seen since the end of November. But more and more governments are, I think, reviewing those restrictions, and we're pleased to see that some, but not all of those, are beginning to be relaxed or removed. And I think that's a positive indication for the industry in terms of what's likely to happen with short-term bookings. So another tough year overall, but quite a bit of positive to take from it as we went through the year. And as I said, cargo again being the star performer in 2021 as it was in 2020. So I'll pause at this point and hand back to Tony, who can take your questions.
Great, thanks very much, Willie. We have a number of questions in the queue, so thank you to all for getting them in there. Covering a number of issues. So perhaps we'll start with something that's in the news today, which is the situation in the Ukraine. And the questioner asks, what precautions are airlines taking with regard to the Ukraine situation, and how would an outbreak of hostilities potentially impact air traffic?
Yeah, well, this is a region of the world that has seen, issues in the past. So, in fact, most airlines have significantly reduced the amount of traffic going through the airspace, and that's been the case for a number of years. So it won't have any significant impact on traffic over the region, and given the volumes of activity that we're seeing at the moment and the fact that most airlines have already avoided that airspace, it shouldn't be an issue. It is being closely monitored. Obviously, we don't discuss openly all of the security briefings that we get, but we are cooperating with all of the relevant agencies, and particularly with Eurocontrol, to ensure that traffic that needs to travel in or around that area is able to avoid any areas of potential conflict. So not seeing any significant impact, and given experience from previous events, I wouldn't expect to see any significant impact on traffic through that area.
Okay, thank you, Willie. A couple of questions on the slide you showed with respect to premium versus economy class travel. One questioner asks if premium economy fits into the economy section or the premium section. And the other questioner asks if you have any indication as to what percentage of the premium class is on non-business travel or private travel.
So premium economy is in the economy figures. So premium, sorry, not sure if you heard me there. Premium economy is in the economy figures. So premium is for people traveling in business class or first class, and economy is in all other cabins. We don't at IATA look at the split between those traveling in premium cabins on business or for leisure, but as I've spoken about previously, and these figures are public, so I'm free to talk about them. If I look at IAG, where the corporate travel represented 13.2% of total revenues, from memory that was 8.5% of revenues in the premium cabin and 4.7% in the non-premium. That's for corporate travel. Now, the total revenues from the premium cabins was clearly higher than that, but I think there's a misunderstanding in the minds of a lot of people as to the total value of business travel. It clearly is an important segment for all airlines, but you should not confuse business travel with premium travel, because there are significant numbers of passengers traveling in premium cabins who are traveling on leisure, and in fact it's significantly higher than those traveling on business from my own experience. And interestingly, that segment, that premium leisure segment, tends to be robust right throughout the cycle. So I think that's a positive, and that chart I think is a strong positive for the airline industry, particularly those who are operating in the long-haul premium segment, which I think should recover quite strongly as we go through 2022.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about something that's been in the news recently, which is unruly passengers. And the questioner says that there's been a spike in recent months in unruly incidents. What is IATA doing about it? And specifically, would blacklists of unruly passengers be an option being shared amongst airlines?
So we have seen an increase in unruly passengers. It's not consistent in terms of the increase right across the world. I think there have been well-documented incidents, particularly in the US domestic market. IATA keeps this situation under review. We have close contact with each of the individual airlines who experience these issues. There has been a lot of debate about blacklist or sharing of names, but I think there are significant legal issues in relation to that. I think this is an area where really, governments need to be involved rather than individual airlines. I think sharing sensitive data amongst airlines, sensitive passenger data amongst airlines, clearly would not be acceptable from a data protection point of view. So the issue of blacklists has been looked at, but I don't think it's something that collectively airlines will pursue, but rather we look to the authorities in each of these countries where there have been experience to take a tough stand. And I think that is the case. I think there's much greater awareness now and less forgiveness being shown to some of the incidents which have clearly been outrageous. So airlines, individual airlines, I know will take a very hard position against passengers and will take measures, I know, to ban them from future travel on their own airline. But sharing that information with other airlines is something that isn't possible and certainly faces legal impediments. But we continue to work with airlines on this issue to look at the overall trends globally. And I think the coverage that the issue has received in the media has been helpful to airlines, particularly when some of the fines, penalties and prison terms that have been issued in recent months. I think that should be a significant deterrent to people who engage in this unruly behaviour.
Thanks, Willie. We have a question from Hong Kong. The questioner notes that Hong Kong has tightened quarantine rules, which means cargo and passenger numbers have plummeted, also stopped transit traffic. And the questioner asks, are you concerned that Hong Kong will be increasingly isolated as the world opens up, and how will this affect it as an aviation hub?
Well, I think Hong Kong has become increasingly isolated. The region has become increasingly isolated as we look at the figures. As I've said, international travel within the region has been hit very, very hard. And you've got to have a lot of sympathy for carriers like Cathay Pacific based in Hong Kong who faced huge operational challenges to keep their business going. So it is of great concern to airlines operating in the region. All we can do is hope that Hong Kong and other parts of Asia will be looking at what's happening in the rest of the world and the experience of other countries as they've attempted to suppress the transmission of the virus, and as they've witnessed the widespread transmission in recent months and the disconnect between the levels of the virus and hospitalization. And I repeat what I've said on many occasions. It's understandable that governments imposed restrictions back in February, March and April of 2020 when we were dealing with an unknown challenge, an unknown virus where we had little information as to what impact it would have. We have a lot of data available to us now, and the science and the medical data, clearly points to governments being able to take a more relaxed position in relation to international travel. So we remain optimistic that governments will respond and in due course open up. But Hong Kong has been severely impacted by the restrictions that have been imposed in the region.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions on the issue of employment within the industry. So an overall question is, how do you see the trend for employment in the industry? And secondly, specifically on staff shortages, and I imagine that's some permanent people who've departed the industry, but also in the current situation where lots of staff are catching Omicron and not available for work. So Willie, do you have any comments on either of those issues?
Yeah, let me comment, and I'll also ask Marie to comment, because I think she might be able to give a general view about labour issues. But specifically, if I look at the airline sector and my own experience, and I've commented on this before, you know, I started in the industry 42 years ago at a time when there was talks about a labour shortage, particularly a pilot shortage. I've never seen one. So since 1979, I've heard it talked about on many occasions. I've never seen one. I think potentially we are looking at that now. We have seen a lot of people leave the industry, a lot of skilled people leave the industry as a result of the forced restructuring that many airlines had to take. I think it's unlikely that all of those or many of those will come back. I think we've also seen people leave the industry because of the uncertainty around the industry, particularly caused by government restrictions. You know, so this issue of I think it's the Great Resignation that's been talked about, impacting on all companies, I think has hit our industry particularly hard. So it is something that I think the industry is aware of. As we gradually rebuild going through 2022, I know all management teams are looking at that. Personally, I remain optimistic that we can attract and retain the right talent, but certainly we've not been helped by the continuous imposition of restrictions on travel, which has created a lot of uncertainty. But Murray, I don't know if there's anything you want to comment on in relation to this.
Well, I cannot resist to bring the gender aspect into this conversation. Obviously, as a woman myself, and if we include women in the labor force at the same level, sort of equal importance as the available men, we basically double the size of the labor force. So of course, gender is a moral issue, but it's also a really simple economic factor that if we manage to put more productive resources into operation, then that is obviously going to lead to better economic outcomes for all. And I think that's an important point also for the aviation industry.
Yeah, and we have, yeah, I think you're right to highlight that, because we've, as IATA highlighted that as one of the challenges the industry faces, particularly in relation to attracting women into jobs that were traditionally seen as male, such as pilots, mechanics, engineers. And that's an area where the industry continues to struggle. So I think we should look at that as an opportunity for the industry, but we clearly have to do a lot more than we have done in the past.
Okay, thank you. We have an overall question on the debt level of the industry, basically asking what are the consequences of the high debt levels, and will that have an impact on as the recovery gathers momentum?
Okay, again, I'll comment, and I'll ask Murray to comment as well. But as we pointed out previously, we've seen debt levels rise significantly as we've gone through this. The last disclosure we did in relation to this was that we estimated that debt had increased by over 200 billion to 650 billion US dollars. And clearly all airlines, with the exception of the cargo or all cargo airlines, have seen their balance sheet stressed through this period. I think most airline CEOs and CFOs will be focused on repairing their balance sheet in the short term, building up liquidity, which clearly is critical at times of uncertainty like this, and that will be a significant focus in the short to medium term for most, if not all, airlines. And I think it will impact on the decisions in relation to capacity, fleet replacement, expansion, M&A. So without question, it's going to impact on how the industry operates from 2022 onwards. So I don't think we'll quickly to revert to the behaviours that we were witnessing in 2019 before all of this started. But Mari, over to you if you want to comment.
Yes, I mean, I think that we're clearly in a situation globally in the world economy where we have arguably unsustainable levels of debt at almost every level in the economy. But we benefit from the relatively fortunate situation that these unsustainable debt levels are unusually affordable. And I think that that's likely going to be the case, certainly in real terms. Even if we might have some increase in nominal interest rates, we also have a bit of an increase in inflation. So the real interest rates that will have to be paid on this debt, I would foresee is going to remain reasonably affordable, probably for decades ahead. And that's a saving grace, of course, in this context.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about another issue that's been in the press this week, which is the dispute between Qatar Airways and Airbus. Basically, two questions. One asking if we see this as becoming, these types of issues as becoming more commonplace going forward, and secondly, does it change the relationship between manufacturers and airlines in any way?
It's a great question, and it's clearly changed the relationship between Qatar and Airbus. And I think a lot of other airlines will be looking at this to see how Airbus responds. Most, if not all of us, will have seen photographs of the Qatar A350s that Qatar Airways is concerned about. And I think myself and a lot of other airline CEOs will want to understand, what has caused that issue. I think it's a challenge for our industry in that, no disrespect to Embraer, but where you have two suppliers, Airbus and Boeing, we need to ensure good, healthy competition between both of those. It's well recognized that Boeing has gone through some challenges and continues to have some challenges, but the industry needs two, if not more, credible suppliers, and we need healthy competition between those. I would hate to think that one of the suppliers is taking advantage of their current market strength to exploit their position, and that's something we're watching very closely. But I know from personal experience, going back many years, we do see this issue of the relationship between individual suppliers and airlines go through phases, and they can be positively and negatively impacted by external events as well as internal events. But I don't think anybody has seen an issue quite as bad as this, and the industry will be watching very carefully at how this plays out and how Airbus responds to their customers. But as I said, the critical issue for the industry is we want to see a strong Boeing and a strong Airbus. And personally, I remain convinced that Boeing will manage their way through the challenges that they faced. I've always seen them as an excellent company, both Airbus and Boeing, excellent companies, and I've had dealings over the years with both of them. But it's important that we get through this particular issue and get back to a more normal relationship between the suppliers and airlines.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have a follow-up question to the one on Hong Kong and travel restrictions. And the questioner is asking more broadly, and I suppose more specifically on China, and specifically on the situation that's evolved between China and the US with respect to market access. And the questioner asks, is there any hope for that situation to change or be resolved? And if so, on what type of timeline would you foresee that?
So we have not been directly involved, and I think we're aware of what has happened, as everybody is. China has been imposing restrictions on flights into China because of the virus and the, if you like, zero COVID approach that they've adopted. Other countries have seen this as a an aggressive change in the bilateral relationship and have responded to the restrictions, and most recently the US imposing restrictions on Chinese carriers to reflect the restrictions that China imposed on US. It's clearly not helpful. The industry works best when these bilateral or multilateral relationships operate without interference. Individual airlines don't need to get involved in politics, and it's not something that helps our industry. So we would all hope that these issues would be resolved and that we can get back to a more normal operating environment where airlines are free to operate under their bilateral agreements to take full advantage of market opportunities. But critically, we all want to ensure that consumers have adequate access to the services that we offer, and we all want to ensure that there's healthy competition between airlines, which benefits the industry and clearly benefits consumers. So I think there's every reason to be optimistic that these issues will be resolved and hopefully resolved quickly, and we get back to a normal operating environment where airlines are competing strongly against one another for customers, and that consumers are benefiting as a result of what has been the traditional strong competition between airlines.
Okay, thank you, Willie. The proposal to purchase IATA, the successor of Alitalia, by MSC and Lufthansa has been in the news this week. And we've had 3 or 4 questions asking if this signals anything for the prospects for consolidation elsewhere in Europe. Also some asking whether the fact that MSC comes from outside of the industry, is that potentially another trend for external investors or investors outside of the industry to come into air transport at this time? So in general, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in general, I don't think it sets any particular trend, and I'm not aware of anything other than what I've read in various media sources or through various media sources. I think if you look at it in the past, Alitalia was owned by the Italian Post Office, and I think the Italian Railway as well. I don't think that encouraged other post offices or railways to invest in the airline industry. So I wouldn't necessarily read anything into this. And as I said, this could all be speculation. I don't have any inside knowledge as to what's going on or whether indeed anything is going on. So I don't think it's going to be a trend, and I don't think it's going to be of great concern to anybody.
Okay, thank you. We have a question looking forward, asking if we expect the impact of Omicron to affect industry earnings this year, and also whether or not we expect it to have an impact on traffic levels in the summer or potentially for the Easter break.
So I'll ask Murray to comment again, although it's probably a bit unfair given that she's only recently joined us to ask her about a prediction, but we will update our forecast. My own view is that it clearly has had some impact because restrictions were reintroduced or introduced by governments after it was identified at the end of November. And some of those restrictions continue to be in place, although I'm pleased to see a number of them are being withdrawn. Disappointing that the UK government announces that it's going to withdraw them, I think from the 12th of February, when in fact they could withdraw them immediately. So that will have had some impact on bookings. We've certainly seen that in previous periods when new restrictions are introduced. But I'm pleased to see that this is probably the shortest period during which we've seen restrictions introduced and then removed. So most of them would have come in late November, early December, and we're beginning to see them removed now. So they've been in place for 7-8 weeks, and it looks like a lot of them probably won't be in place for more than 10 weeks. So it will have had some impact, but it's too early to say at this point. But I know Murray and the team will be looking at a forecast for 2022 in due course. So maybe, I don't know, Murray, do you want to comment?
Yes, I think that we saw the year end somewhat better than our worst fears given Omicron. So a little bit of a positive upside there in the face of this new variant, although it's clearly the case that the year would have been better had we not had Omicron. And then we think that this effect is perhaps going to impact January and February, but from then on we would expect a renewed reconnection with the improving trend that we had seen previously. And I can only, of course, totally agree with the point regarding regulation, that it's always a danger, I think, on the behalf of regulators, with all due respect to them, but nevertheless, always a tendency to put in regulation and then be very slow in taking it off. And this is clearly a package of regulation that is related to an emergency situation when we no longer have that emergency of overwhelming hospitalization systems. Then I think that we need to call on the regulators to act as quickly on removing them as they did on imposing them. And if that is the case, then we should be able to look forward to a healthy summer season for the aviation industry.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about slots, and particularly some issues raised by Lufthansa about ghost flights. The question has two parts. First part is, do we agree with the position of Lufthansa that the use it or lose it rules should be further relaxed in Europe? And the second part is, do you think the message about ghost flights has been somehow detrimental to the perception of the industry with respect to its environmental performance?
So we do agree with Lufthansa. I think Carsten Spohr raised some very relevant issues in relation to slots. And I think if you look at what he said, he was particularly highlighting the fact that what we call the justified or justifiable non-use of slots isn't being evenly applied by slot regulators. So you can get a slot regulator at one end of the route. So if you're operating between two slot-constrained airports, one slot coordinator will say, yes, I think you can use the JNUS, as we call it. The other end says, no, I don't agree, which forces you to operate because you have to have an agreement at both airports. And I think this is something that's created a lot of confusion within the market and has imposed additional restrictions. So the general concept of justified non-use of slots is good, but if it's not being evenly applied, it clearly has limited, if any, value. So I think he has highlighted some very important issues. We've asked that there should be, if you like, a better definition and a common definition that would allow the justified non-use of slots to kick in, which is in addition to the general slot alleviation. But as we've talked about, if you look at where we are, international travel is still heavily suppressed. And although it's improving, it's nowhere close to where you would hope it would be. So in 2021, it's less than 25%, 24.5% of where we were in 29. There's still a long way to go. And the point is, for operators, hub operators like Lufthansa, it's not just about the long-haul flight that they're operating, because as many of you will know, hubs work on transfer traffic, and in some cases you could have an international flight with high volumes of transfer traffic, 70–80%. So the cancellation of the long-haul flight doesn't just directly impact on that long-haul flight, it can have a huge impact on the short-haul traffic and flights that are feeding into the hub. And this isn't always recognized in the general slot rules, and clearly slots at hub airports are absolutely critical, because to be able to function efficiently as a hub, you have to be able to have coordination between arriving and departing flights. So I think Carsten was right to highlight this issue. He operates a number of hubs, so The impact of this on the Lufthansa business has probably been felt more than on other businesses. And he wasn't saying that he would be operating empty flights. So this concept, ghost flight, is a term that was developed years ago when I think there was some evidence of activity in the distant past. Certainly, I'm not aware, in my own experience, of airlines that I've worked with deliberately operating a completely empty flight just to maintain a slot. The point is that these flights will be operating with low volumes of passengers, and his argument is that if there was greater flexibility in the slot rules, then some of these flights would not be operated. There would be little or no inconvenience to the customer because generally it would be for connecting passengers who wouldn't be taking the long-haul flight because the long-haul flight is cancelled. His argument, I think, has a lot of merit. And I think we need to look more closely at what's involved here rather than just using simple blanket figures like 80%, 70%, 64%. Now, I have to give credit to the Commission. I think Europe has been flexible and certainly has responded constructively to the issue. And I would hope would continue to look at this in a constructive manner. So I think some of the coverage has exaggerated the issue by deliberately suggesting that these flights would be operated empty. That wasn't the case. In many cases, the flights that would be operated with low volumes of passengers, with plenty of other options to facilitate the customer. So I think this is an issue that we should closely look at. We are continuing to have dialogue, and it's disappointing that we've seen generally a constructive response from the EU and a less constructive response on this issue from the UK, who recently announced the slot rules for summer 2022 at 70-30, better than 80-20, but significantly worse than what the EU has agreed at 64-36. So, yes, Carson was right to highlight it, and I think if there was an honest discussion around this, the data could be very interesting and may well lead to a different response from regulators.
Thank you, Willie. Continuing on the topic of environment, we have a question about CORSIA, and the questioner first notes that ICAO estimates emissions from aviation not reaching 2019 levels until somewhere between 2023 and 2029, depending on various scenarios of industry recovery. So the question is, first, what does this do for the credibility of CORSIA? And do you think it would or should prompt the industry to be more ambitious with respect to its approach to purchasing offsets?
Well, I think the industry is ambitious, and if you look at what we've done recently, agreeing to net zero by 2050, which I think is a significant development on behalf of the industry to align ourselves with many governments. And in fact, once again, for an industry segment to come together collectively to agree that we have to do this, the positive from an environmental point of view is that emissions from the industry have significantly reduced. Now, it's as a result of the crisis that we're facing, but that is positive from an environmental point of view. CORSIA was designed to provide, if you like, carbon neutral growth from 2020, and it will achieve that, and it will have a significant impact going forward. So I think CORSIA has been a very positive development to get global agreement on the measures that can be taken to have credible, verifiable, audited offsets that can be used by the industry. A very positive step because I think the general issue of offsetting has had some credibility issues, but CORSIA sets a very high standard So I think people should look at CORSIA as a significant positive from which we can build. And that's what I've always said. You know, CORSIA was a very significant first step. It was never going to be the final step. And in fact, there's a lot of work that we need to do and a lot of work that we will do between now and achieving our goal of net zero by 2050. And I know there are individual airlines who want to go faster than that. And personally, I'm hugely encouraged by what we're seeing in terms of technological developments. So some issues that many of us thought would be impossible in the time frame are now looking more and more realistic and very credible. You know, particularly things like hybrid electric, and hydrogen. You know, between now and probably 2035, and I think we're going to witness a new revolution in the industry as a result of this technology. So the industry is being, I think, absolutely credible, realistic. We're not trying to mislead anybody by setting targets that aren't going to be challenging. But more importantly, we've set ourselves targets that I think will drive us to do things in a different way so that we can achieve the goals that we've set. And those goals, you know, align very closely with the current science. That may change going forward. Science can always suggest that you have to go faster, and I've no doubt that if that is the case, the industry will respond constructively to that. But I'm very optimistic based on what I've seen over the past 12 months that our industry is not only aware of what it is we need to do, but is absolutely determined to achieve the targets that we have set and that others will set for us.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions around 5G, and I guess basically there are three. One is, are we satisfied or comfortable with the temporary resolution that was achieved? Do we think that's a permanent resolution, or will it flare up again? And thirdly, why was this an issue in the US and doesn't appear to be an issue elsewhere?
Well, I think there's been a lot written about why it's an issue in the US and not elsewhere. You know, power output, the frequency range that has been used. So, you know, we have seen the introduction of 5G in many countries without problem, but it hasn't been on the same basis as has been proposed in the US. The temporary arrangement, I think, addresses the issue, but clearly the industry would have much preferred to have seen the standoff avoided and to have had sensible resolution of the issue on a permanent basis long before you know, the deadline for introduction of 5G in the US. There is still work that needs to be done. You know, we're not going to compromise on safety, and I think that is the most important issue. A problem has been identified. The probability is extremely low, but you know, we work on probabilities that are extremely low, but the consequences of one of these events taking place, you know, could be severely harsh. So, you know, it's a risk that the industry is not prepared to take. And given that we're not prepared to compromise and never will compromise on the safety standards that we set, it's very important that we you know, protect the safety of the industry and eliminate these risks where it's possible to eliminate them. And clearly this is a risk that was possible and is possible to eliminate by some sensible and you know, the industry would argue simple measures that could avoid this. So we do need a permanent solution. We need to ensure that the I don't know if there's going to be a 6G, a 7G and an 8G, so we just need to make sure that issues that have been identified don't get repeated into the future. And it may require us to do different things, which clearly we're always prepared to do, but you know, we're not going to compromise on safety standards.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Europe, and it reflects an announcement by Eurocontrol, or an expectation by Eurocontrol, that European flight levels will return to about 70 to 90% of 2019 levels this year. And the questioner asks, what does that mean for the need for progress on things like single European sky, efficiency, and modernization of air traffic management? And then are there any specific initiatives or goals that you'd like to see achieved by European airlines this year with respect to that?
Yeah, this issue is one of great frustration for the industry on two levels. You know, the flight volumes that Eurocontrol is talking about to a large degree will be driven by the slot rules. And I think it's important to highlight that, and that was one of the issues being highlighted by Carsten Spohr, because what Eurocontrol is looking at is the volume of flights. It's not looking at the volume of passengers on board those flights. And you know what we've seen going through 2021 are very, very low seat factors. You know, I highlighted the situation with the international flights within Asia. You know, 26% seat factors. You know, within Europe, the seat factors have been higher than that, but still significantly lower than, just looking at it here, 73% was the seat factor within Europe in 2021, and that's versus 87% in 2019. So, you know, we need to ensure that when we do get back to high volumes of flights, that the ATC environment is capable of managing those volumes without the delays that we have seen in 2019 and 2018, which clearly were outrageous. And let's repeat, because it is important, those delays were largely caused by inadequate planning on the part of air navigation service providers, or in the case of France, as a result of industrial action by French air traffic controllers, which had a huge impact on the levels of traffic that could operate through France. So I think these are measures that do need to be addressed, particularly in the context of the environment. It is completely unacceptable in this day and age that we continue to operate aircraft inefficiently because governments and politicians are unable or unwilling to address this issue. If for no other reason, they should address it because of the environmental impact that this inefficient air traffic control network over Europe causes. It's estimated we could eliminate 10 to 12% of CO2 over Europe from the aviation industry if we had a properly functioning single European sky. And that would be a huge reduction. So, you know, we will challenge and continue to challenge governments, because it's not Eurocontrol. To their credit, Eurocontrol have been excellent in highlighting the issues and providing the data to support the arguments. But we need governments to recognise that it's within their control to address this issue.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple minutes left before 3 o'clock, but we have several questions in the queue. Willie, are you okay if we go on with a couple more questions?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So one is a clarification on your comments with respect to the Airbus Qatar Airways dispute. And the questioner says, just for clarification, do you think Airbus is taking advantage of its current market position in the dispute with Qatar Airways, or was that a more general statement?
It was a more general statement, but I have to say I've tried to think back to when a manufacturer cancelled a contract with an airline, you know, and that's something completely new. Well, you know, I know it has happened on very rare occasions, but the occasions on which it's happened have generally been because the airline couldn't afford to pay for the aircraft, which clearly isn't the case in relation to Qatar Airways. So that's a worrying development. To be honest with you, I could probably list 100 airlines who would have liked to have cancelled their contracts with Airbus in 2020, but Airbus were definitely not willing to allow those airlines to do so. So, you know, I think it is a new development and one that everybody in the industry will be looking at and trying to better understand.
Okay. Next question is referencing the IATA travel pass, and it's just asking for an update on that and how you see the implementation of that going forward.
Yeah, we're very pleased. It's been in if you like commercial operations with Qantas since late December, and functioning very well. We have it in operations with a number of international airlines. As we've talked about on many occasions, it comes into its own as we see international travel significantly increase, and given the processing times, if every passenger has to go to a check-in desk, to enable airlines to offer a digital solution to their customers. So, we developed the IATA Travel Pass in anticipation of these requirements continuing. It would be great if these requirements were completely removed and there was no need for the IATA Travel Pass, but to enable airlines to provide digital solutions and to facilitate customers to continue to check in without having to go to an airport check-in counter is very important. So I forget the number. I think we've signed and we're operating with something like 15 airlines now, and that number is increasing.
Okay, thank you. We have a question over the general financial state of the industry, and particularly referencing some early calls in the crisis where the specter of bankruptcies or large-scale bankruptcies by airlines was raised. The questioner asks, that hasn't really happened. So is that still a possibility, or do you think we're out of the woods on that? And then the second part of that would be looking at Asia specifically, which has suffered long-term with very low levels of international traffic, and asking if the situation there is a bit different from the rest of the world.
So I think we published some figures recently which showed, from memory, 80, I think it was 86 airlines have failed in 85 or 86 in 20 and 21, and we've seen 39 new airlines start. Now, some of those are reincarnations of airlines that were in place. So we have seen a significant number of failures since this started. Now, in many cases, these are small airlines, but we always predicted that the airlines that were most vulnerable were the smaller airlines. There have been a number of high-profile failures as well. So I think there's still a lot of challenges out there for airlines, particularly as we go through the ramp-up of activity that we would anticipate to see in 2022. Fuel increasing, as I showed there, jet over $100 a barrel. That will represent a financial challenge to many airlines who aren't hedged. And in fact, I think the level of hedging, even amongst those who are hedged, remains historically low. So, there are headwinds ahead of us. But the flip side to that is, generally a high oil price reflects a strong economic environment, and strong economic environments normally are beneficial to the industry. So, it has been an incredibly challenging 2 years. I think many airlines remain in place because of the severe measures that they've had to take. And indeed, we have to recognize that in some cases, government support has enabled airlines to continue to operate, more so in some parts of the world, like the US, and in some parts of Europe than globally. But I think there are a lot of airlines that will continue to be stressed and have to work hard as we go through 2022. But I think the picture for the industry is certainly looking more positive going into 2022 than it was going into 2021. And sorry, the second part of that question, Tony, was in relation to. I think.
Let me just reflect back. Why don't we move on to one more question, then we'll come back to that one.
Okay.
So we had a question asking about the political situation in Latin America, and saying over the last 2 years, we've seen a shift to the left in the politics of the region. And the questioner is asking if we are concerned that that could affect air regulation matters in that part of the world.
It can. Political change, whether it's shift to the left or shift to the right, or indeed shift to the centre, can impact. So, yeah, I don't think it necessarily depends on the direction of travel of the governments in the region. I think it just reflects often the changing focus that some governments will have in relation to aviation, transport, and their economy in general. So we deal with these issues. I don't think it represents anything that is significantly different to what we've experienced in the past, and we've managed and lived through political change before, and I would expect us to be able to do so, efficiently going forward as well.
Okay, thank you. We have a question looking, a couple of questions actually on the AGM, and asking whether or not we are confident that that can take place as an in-person event in China.
Yeah, well, we are committed to holding an in-person event on the dates that we have identified, and our colleagues in China remain confident that it will take place. We keep it under review, as you would expect. I think the recent developments are not very positive, but there's still significant time to go before we hold it. But we will be holding an in-person event for the AGM on the dates that we have specified, and we are committed to doing so in Shanghai.
Recently, there have been a spate of security instances or events in the UAE, Ukraine, also Belarus. And the questioner asks, what is the significance of this for airlines planning routes, planning their market development? Is there anything particular about this time that will be different from other times? Or I suppose just general comments on the overall planning around these sort of hotspots?
No, we've had to deal with these issues in the past, and external events that impact on the business are something we're well used to. We don't openly discuss security issues. We do have close contact and sharing of information where it's possible to share information. But airlines are well used to managing these events. Sometimes it can lead to temporary changes. Other times it can be more structural, but generally they tend to be temporary amendments to the way in which we would operate. So again, I don't see it having a significant impact on the industry.
Okay, maybe we'll take just the last couple of questions. One would be referencing back to the question on bankruptcy that we discussed earlier. The second part of the question was asking about government aid and whether an ending of government aid and the potential payback could impact the industry this year. And the second is there still a call for government aid to the industry from IATA?
Well, I think where governments impose restrictions and prevent airlines from operating, I think it's perfectly reasonable for the airlines that are impacted by that to ask for assistance from their governments, no different to any other industry. In fact, in most, if not all cases, the aid that has been provided has been aid that's been provided to other industries as well. And as we've seen in some countries, significant support has been provided to other industries, more so than the airline industry. So I don't think it's unreasonable for airlines to consider the financial impact that these government restrictions have, and to look to their governments to respond to that and provide some assistance. Clearly, debt has to be paid back. Whether it's from governments or from commercial sources, and all of the airlines that have received the debt that they've been, I think, glad to have access to, will be conscious of the need to repay that. The time frame for repayment varies in different countries. In some cases, it was short term, and others it was long term, 5 to 10 years in some cases. So it clearly, like all debt repayments, does have an impact. You have to be conscious of the cash that has to be repaid at some point. I don't think it's distorted competition. I think in most cases, it has been in the form of debt that has to be repaid. There have been some areas where significant grants have been made available, and that has clearly supported airlines in those regions. But in most cases where grants have been made available, it has been directly to support employees and to maintain employment, which I think has been a positive for the individuals that have been supported, helpful for the airlines because those individuals are still available to enable the airline to rebuild their network, and clearly positive for the economies of the countries where governments have done that. But like Maury said, ultimately it's all going to be paid back. It'll have to be paid back, and that could have policy implications in some countries. But generally, I'm not concerned, and I don't think it's going to distort or put undue pressure on any airlines.
Okay, and then I think the last question for today, we'll look ahead to 2022. And there were a number of questions sort of asking for how we see traffic levels evolving over the course of the year, what we see as the potential for relaxation of travel restrictions and specific measures on travel. So perhaps, Willie, maybe just a last comment on how you see those two issues working together and where you see the industry approaching towards the end of 2022.
Well, I know this is an area that Maury and her team will want to focus on, and I'm sure she will want to give you a view on that. I'm not going to ask her to give it now because it would be unfair to do that until she's done the analysis, but let me give you a personal view. I'm optimistic. I think the trends that we're witnessing at the moment are positive. We are seeing improving passenger demand as restrictions get removed. We are seeing restrictions being removed or relaxed, and I think that augurs well. And I remain confident that the underlying demand, people want to travel. It's very clear based on all of the research that we do that people have missed the opportunity to be able to travel for holidays, to visit friends, to visit relatives, to travel for business, and want to get back to the freedom that they've enjoyed for many years. So going into 2022, or now that we're in 2022, I look at this year as a positive development. I take a lot of comfort from some of the trends that we witnessed through December. As Maury said, we expected Omicron to have a more severe impact on the performance in December, so we take that as a positive. Our worst fears were, didn't develop, and in fact, December was, I would say, significantly better than we had expected. And again, I'm encouraged by the chart I showed you on the recovery in international premium versus international economy travel. Now, long way to go, long way to go, and many challenges ahead. But as we sit here and talk, I think the signs are certainly more positive than they have been in a while.
Super. Thank you very much, Willie. I think with that, we'll call this briefing to a close. Many thanks to all those who have joined. I see there's still a very large number of journalists who stuck with us till the end, so we appreciate that. Thank you for following the developments of the industry. Certainly, this is going to be a very important year for the aviation industry. We'll be doing these briefings on a regular basis and encourage you and look forward to you joining them as we move forward through 2022. With that, I'll call this briefing to a close. Have a good rest of your day and good rest of the week. Thank you.